Forspoken. Forspoken is a perfect example of a game that had so much potential and did absolutely nothing with it. And in a lot of cases, when a game like this comes out and flops, that's a lot worse than a game that you know is going to be bad. When Forspoken was revealed, it really did look like the next-gen game of our dreams, and was really going to push the next-gen consoles to its limits. But, unfortunately, it didn't even break the ceiling. Forspoken follows Frey Holland, an orphan girl from New York City who was found all alone underneath the Holland Tunnel one night 21 years ago. As the game opens with Frey in a familiar environment, a courthouse. Apparently this isn't her first time here, and she's very well acquainted with the judge and the people around her. She was doing a job for a local gang of hoodlums that had gone wrong, and now she finds herself back here. After being given a very light sentence from the judge, she leaves the courthouse only to be surrounded by the gang, which she was working for. She's then pursued by the gang and escapes and finds her way home. Once she gets home, we see that Frey really isn't living the high life. Barely any furniture or food is to be seen in the house, and she lives all alone, except for her cat Homer. Exhausted from the chase, she decides it's time to get some sleep and goes to bed, only to find her apartment ablaze, set by the gang who had been chasing her home. She was able to escape, but now homeless and realizing she can't care for her cat Homer, she passes it off to the judge who sentenced her earlier in the day, and decides to visit Holland Tunnel, as it's now her birthday. While visiting the tunnel, she hears a voice, and it draws her to a mysterious bracelet. Upon touching the bracelet, it activates a portal that draws her in. She awakes in the world of Athia. The bracelet, now bonded to her arm, reveals that it is sentient and can only be heard by Frey. Frey refers to the bracelet as Cuff, and finds that he has a work of magical abilities inside of her, which she must now use in order to work with Cuff to defeat the Tunters, the former benevolent rulers of Athia, in order to find her way home. Now on paper this sounds like a good story, right? Sounds interesting, intriguing, and so many questions posed at the start of the game. Who's Cuff? Why can Frey use magic? Where is Athia? How is she going to get home? These questions do eventually get answered, but not before having to spend a good 40 hours in the most boring world imaginable, with some of the most annoying characters in video games today. Take Frey herself, for example. She's extremely unlikable. She throws in random cuss words and F words whenever she feels like it. She doesn't really feel like a character, and more like what an adult thinks a teenager would be like in this day and age. She doesn't act like a normal person, and after being thrown into this magical world, she takes to her powers very quickly and the world around her, which really just doesn't feel right. It feels rushed. So let's break the game down. So, graphically the game is quite gorgeous, most of the time, especially in cutscenes or when you look directly at the characters, but the game does suffer from a little bit of blurriness when looking into the distance and really bad pop-in. Like just walking slowly from point A to point B and looking into the distance, not even that far into the distance, you'll see plants and enemies pop in as you move along, and as you move back, they pop out. Most of the time you're not going to notice because of the game's fluid parkour system that allows you to move really, really quickly through the world. So I feel like they didn't take as much care into making sure that everything loaded in properly, or loaded in before you're able to see it, because they expect you to be moving too fast to see it anyway. But that's not really an excuse, especially for a game that is like a flagship PS5 title at the time. There really is no excuse. But before we move on to the open world, let's talk about the movement. Now the movement works with a fluid parkour system. Holding down a button allows your character to move quickly, but it also drains a meter. It allows you to do things like automatically flip, jump, and move around the world. And moving around the world is quite fun. I don't really have many issues with the movement, but it's the world itself I take a lot of issue with. The world itself is incredibly and aggressively empty. We're supposed to believe that Athia was a kingdom ruled by 4 different rulers, but you just don't feel it. One main town in the center, which is sort of like your little town hub that you come backwards and forwards to. As you go to 4 different castles in the 4 different regions of the world, there are small little towns here and there that I believe was supposed to believe are empty because of the break, which is fine, but when the largest city in the game feels like the smallest city in The Witcher, it just doesn't really help me believe that this was once a big thriving world where people lived together and were ruled by 4 different rulers. 4 different rulers didn't need to rule one city. The other 4 different biomes are also very, very empty. Apart from a couple of enemies here and there and a couple of bigger enemies, the world just feels really empty. But I'm getting carried away. Let's recap really quickly. The world is big, open, beautiful, lots of places to go, but none of it's interesting. It feels empty, enemies, uninteresting, but let's talk combat. Straight out of the gate, Frey has access to one style of magical abilities, but as the game goes on and you defeat the Tunter, the former rulers who have gone mad with power, or so you've been told, who are now the dictators as opposed to benevolent rulers, defeating them allows you to use their magical power. Cuff absorbs their magic and allows you to use their magic. For example, the first fight you have against Sylar, She uses fire magic. So once she's defeated, Cuff will then absorb her magic and you're able to use fire magic. You're then able to head out into the world, defeat enemies, collect mana, and become proficient in that style of magic. All the Tunta use elemental magic. For example, the next one you have to fight has water. It's all elemental based. And that's where the game gets its first point for me. The boss fights are actually quite interesting and fun. The one time in the game where you actually feel like a powerhouse, and it's some of the most fun you're going to have in the game. Although Frey shouldn't be as proficient in fighting as she is, these are some of the most interesting encounters that you're going to have in the game. Okay, let's talk story. We briefly touched on it at the start about how the story begins, and I have to say the story is probably one of the weakest aspects of the game. Now, I know I've bashed on this game a lot, but I put more than 40 hours into this game. I've platinumed the game. I put my heart and soul into the game, and I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, the story has major issues. One being it's not interesting. It's not interesting in the slightest, and at no point do I feel like I care about Frey. Do I care about Cuff? Do I care about the people around me? The pacing is all over the place. It doesn't feel well paced at all. As a matter of fact, I feel like the story would have been better off focusing on the 4 Tunta, fighting off the invading forces all those years ago. And if what I believe is true, the DLC does exactly that. The little droplets of history we get of the world are far more interesting than the world we're playing in. At the moment, I think it would have been a lot better if the game had allowed you to swap between the 4 Tuntas fighting off the invading army 21 years ago. I think it would have been more interesting, and hopefully when I get to the DLC, because yes, one day I will get to the DLC. I've given enough of myself to this game by now that there's no going back. I will play it, and hopefully it's enjoyable. But as the game is right now without the DLC, it's just very forgettable. I'm struggling to remember major plot points that happened, and I just finished it again for this review. The game, much like this review, is all over the place, and it's really hard for me to pinpoint exactly what the issue is. I feel like deep down there's a good game here. Combat can feel great once you get the hang of it. Traversal feels like some of the best out there, and I had more than enough fun running across this empty world, flipping, moving around, grappling. It was good to get from point A to point B, but the characters and the world, the story really comes in under par. And sometimes a game that fails to live up to potential that you see in it is far worse than a game that is just bad. Maybe this game needed a little bit more time, but I guess we'll never know. Here's hoping when I finally get to the DLC that it delivers on the potential that I, and I'm sure many others, saw in this game. Because that's really its last chance, as the team behind Forspoken have since been shut down and are no longer making games. So a sequel to this game feels nigh impossible. But, who knows, maybe one day Frey will get to continue her story. But as it stands today, Forspoken is one of those games that you can entirely miss unless you see it for $5 in a bargain bin. Then I would definitely suggest you pick it up and at least give it a go. Otherwise, maybe Forspoken should just be forgotten.